Yes, good. Okay, I'm going to speak in English. Sorry about that. I have 0 words of Russian, so there we go. Okay, so I'm talking about WebFonts. So how many of you are front-end developers or otherwise construct websites in some way? Yeah, actually put your hand up if you're not. Okay, probably that would be easier. And how many use WebFonts on your websites in any way? Okay, less, but still quite a few. Actually, it turns out something like 70% of all, well, the top 100,000 websites use WebFonts now. That number has gone up from 1% 10 years ago. So it's quite, but just using them isn't really sufficient. What I'm hoping to teach you about today is how to use them well. So let's get started. I guess I should explain who I am. Well, okay, that matches the picture, so you know it's me. Chris Lilley, SVJesus is my Twitter handle. I'm a technical director at the World Wide Web Consortium, and some other job titles stuff. I started SVG, obviously not by myself, but I started it. Co-author of the PNG image format, worked on CSS 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and actually 5 now. Also, I was the first chair of the WebFonts working group that produced that font face. Worked on WAF 1 and WAF 2 and so on. So what are we going to talk about today? First thing, some basics. Just some terminology to make sure, because I'm going to use these terms all the way through the talk, and if you're not exactly sure what they mean, then it's not going to work. So first is that. Then I'm going to talk about variable fonts. How many people here have heard of variable fonts? Good, a few. You'll know more about them after the talk. Then color fonts, chromatic fonts. And then lastly, slightly old stuff, but still interesting, open type features used from CSS. So, basics. First of all, who can tell me what that is on the screen? Anyone? It's metal type, and it's backwards because you had to put the ink on and then press it into the paper, and that's how it worked. So, first of all, a character. A character is just a number. It's like A is 65, but it has properties. For example, capital A has the property of not being punctuation, not being a number, it is an uppercase letter, etc. It's a Latin character, this sort of thing. A glyph, on the other hand, is the actual shape, the thing that you see in print. You can imagine the difference because if you're listening to a screen reader or something like that, you still have characters, but if you're using text-to-speech, you don't have glyphs. So what is that? What is that on screen? It is a ligature. Well done. Even jumping ahead. It is a character, but it's also a ligature. How many characters is it? It is 2 characters, hopefully, but it's just 1 glyph. This, again, is actually either 1 or 2 characters, depending on if you have combining accents or not. It's 1 glyph. And it could actually use up to 2 fonts if you combine them from 2 different fonts, which would be really awkward, so don't do that. It would look horrible. Some more terminology. Myriad Pro is an example of a font family. And within that family, you have faces. There are 6 faces there. A light, a Roman, a bold, a condensed, an italic, and so on. The next bit of terminology I want to be sure you're aware of is descriptors. So how many people have used an @font face rule? A few, yes. And in there you will see some descriptors, but also in your CSS you'll see properties. So let's explain the difference. There's an example. We've got a font family, we've got a font weight, but also in the H1 there we've got a font family and a font weight. These are different. The descriptor is saying this is what this font can do. Like it is a bold font. Whereas the property on the H1 is saying, I want the H1 to be in a bold font. It's a request for styling. So they have the same name, so you can see how they match up. But it does confuse people sometimes because they look as if they're the same thing. So yeah, descriptors at the top, properties at the bottom. Font stacks. You don't just specify a single font, you usually have a list of them, a stack. So here's an example of how that works. If you have a Japanese font and you look in Latin text, you often find it looks really sucky and horrible because they didn't really care about those. So what you want to do is make sure the Latin glyphs come from a better font first. So you put it first and then Japanese one afterward. Well, that's fine until someone starts adding some Japanese characters to your Latin font. You can't put them both first, so what do? You use something called Unicode range. This tells you what the allowed range of characters is, and you can restrict it down. So here's an example. We've got a Japanese font there, and it has this Unicode range with this complicated set of numbers, which tells you what characters. So you can tell, obviously, which characters this uses, right? No, you can't. I can't. I have a confession to make. This syntax is something that I invented in 1997. I regret it ever since. It is awful, really awful. It's also implemented everywhere, so we cannot change it now, so tough. Okay, so here's an example. We've got a heading there. Let's look at this. And I want to have the ampersand use a different font. So how do I do that? Well, the Unicode code point for ampersand is 26. So let us... Where's my cursor? Okay. Okay, so I've given it a Unicode range. And now I'm going to add that font in. There, and suddenly it uses that. Let's mutilate this Unicode range so that it doesn't work anymore. And it stops working. There we go. In fact, what I've done is there, I've mistyped this Unicode range, so now it applies to the whole thing. There. Quite simple. So now variable fonts. Variable fonts are the hot new thing. They're going to change really how we use fonts on the web. Here's an example of a font family. As you can see, it has a bunch of different weights, and it also has a bunch of different widths, condensed fonts and expanded fonts. It also has what's called a text block, which is designed for small text, or you want slightly different sizes. This is called optical sizing. So all in all, if you wanted to use all of those on your web page, you would have to download a bunch of different fonts, separate ones. Like 37 separate fonts for that one. That's going to take a long time to load. Your page is not going to display properly, or it's going to display using the wrong font. With variable fonts, you download one font. Obviously, it's bigger, but it's not 37 times bigger. And then it has what's called an axis of variation, something that can change. For that one, it would be the weight and also the width. And then you just say what value you want, and it generates it on the fly. So this is new in CSS Fonts 4, which I'm telling you about mostly today. So here's an example. This is a glyph, and you can see the control points that define the shape of the glyph. And then if you wanted to have a more bold one, you would draw it again, but with different points, different positions. That's the old way to do it. Very labor-intensive as well. Whereas with variable fonts, you basically move the points to make a bolder version. You move them again to make a narrower version. And what you store in the actual font is the changes that you made, the shifts, the deltas. Once you've got that, you can interpolate, you can produce any of the range, not just here's a bold, here's a normal, here's a light, but anything in between, all of them. So I talked about axes of variation. There are 5 which are standardized. The italicness, this is kind of poorly defined. It's like, how italic is it? Okay. Optical size. When people made actual lead type and metal type for old style printing, they would use slightly different shapes for the letters. The small ones would be simplified, a bit more open, and the bigger ones would be like finer and more refined. So this is optical sizing. So in a variable font, you can actually have an optical sizing axis that says how big is this, how big is the text being displayed, and you can make those subtle changes to it depending on how it's resized. And then the slant, if you have an oblique font, you can squint the letters over. Well, not actually transform them mechanically, but it's in the variable font, it can say how much of an angle you want. And again, you can vary that continuously. And then the width and the weight we already saw in the previous example. And this is how you'd use it in CSS. So there's a new property called font variation settings, and it takes these obscure cryptic 4-letter codes, and it takes some different numbers. The numbers depend on how the font was constructed, unfortunately. So you have to look at the font and say, okay, in this case, 2.4 is a sort of a medium weight, and 3.7 is the heaviest. And it's not very nice, but it does work. And this works in browsers at the moment. We've got a width and we've got an optical size. This says it wants to be 32 points high. Not very convenient, not very friendly, but it does actually give you the result. So a quick question for you. Here's 2 lines of CSS. Firstly, I've set the font weight to 400. And then I'm using calc to work out the answer for 9 times 100. Audience participation time. Is the result 400 or is the result 900? Hands up for 400. Hands up for 900. Hands up for I have no idea what you're talking about, I wish you'd finish. Okay, the answer is it depends. Until recently, the answer was 400. Why? Because that looks like a number, but it's not. Seriously, I kid you not. In CSS3, the font weight was a set of defined strings that look like numbers. You can't make this stuff up. It really was. It was a thing called looked like 100, but it wasn't. You couldn't treat it as a number. If you looked in the DOM, it wasn't actually a number. It was a string. Yeah. It was actually done that way because, especially in Windows, that's the way they defined it. We kind of went along with that. In CSS4, hooray! It's actually a number between 1 and 999, like the OpenType spec says it should be. So I'm doing the same thing I did before, but this time I'm using the good old properties. Font weight. We already know about font weight. Why are you telling us, Chris? Because this isn't new. Yes, it is. Look at the value. 362. Yeah, that works totally now. Similarly, font stretch. 100 is normal. 70 is condensed. 150 is expanded. Font optical sizing. Now remember I showed you before and I said you have to put the point size that you're designing for. We don't want that in CSS. We don't want you to have to keep changing the value of one property every time you change the font size. So we just have 2 values, basically on and off. Auto means yes, it's on, and off, which you probably don't want, says no, we don't want optical sizing to be used. That's it. And it does the calculations itself. So, same table we saw before, but this is how you use it in CSS. This is the better way to do it. Using font style for the italic and the slant, using font optical sizing, font stretch, font weight. And here's an example. Now this font, I remember I said it can make these fonts on the fly. Yes, that means you can animate them. Yes, you really can. Now this is animating a number of things. It's animating the weight. You've got thin strokes and thick strokes. But also the height of the lowercase letters here is also changing. You see they're getting taller? So you can animate multiple aspects of a font at once. You can create instances of the font that you want, but you can also animate them for a visual effect. Or, of course, you can animate them if you want to fit text into a particular size. You know what the size is. The font is just big enough to actually occupy all the size. So here's how we do this. We've got the same at font face before with the font family and the source. But notice now, font weight has 2 numbers. It says that it goes from 100 to 900 and anywhere in between. So you can say for a given font what ranges it supports. The font style, it goes from -10 degrees slanted one way to 40 degrees the other way. And then in the properties, we say what actually we want. We want a font weight of 234, and it will go and make it for us. We want a font stretch of 80%, just slightly condensed. It makes it for us. So that is the old way, but it's actually still what you have to do if you want to animate it. There's a CSS animation, just animating the weight. And remember I said you have to use these weird numbers for that, unfortunately. Okay, live demo time. Let's see if this works. Yes, it does. This is a variable font. Remember I told you there are standard axes of variation? There are also non-standard axes. You can have anything you want. This font has an axis for leaves and an axis for how much it grows, and it's all being animated. Looks like that. Excuse me. Looks like grass. It's still actually text. You know, you can edit it. It's real text. I didn't do this demo, by the way. It's done by someone called Mandy Kerr. But there's the CSS. You can see this. It's not that difficult. It's just straightforward animation. A little bit of filter effects as well. Okay, here's another example. This is using variable fonts to do frankly stupid and ridiculous things. But if you want to do that, if you want to have blobs that switch on and off and whatever, you can make a font like that. A more reasonable example, notice that as this font gets heavier, some of the internal detail gets obscured, the strokes get bigger. So the designer has chosen at a particular point to simplify the design. You still get the effect of a stroke, but it's just at the top and bottom. So you can have a sudden switch from one form to another. I particularly like this example. Notice that the text occupies the same width regardless of what we do to it. We're animating the weight, we're animating the X height, but we're also animating the width so that the overall result is that it stays the same regardless. This obviously has implications for responsive web design. You can use fonts more creatively. You know how much space you have on a particular page, and you can fill it precisely. Someone else has a different screen, different sizes. They get a font that's specific for them. Now, you're probably looking at this and going, okay, but if I have a font, how do I know what it can do? This website is called What Can My Font Do, which is a pun. What can my font do? Let's have a look at it. Not that one, that's not a font. Excuse me. Okay, so the font that I saw in the graph example is called Amstelvar, and I'm going to grab this font and drop it on this website. And it immediately tells me, so the font isn't actually uploaded, this is all client-side JavaScript working here. It tells me it's a true type variable font, it has 541 characters, it's got 10 axes of variation, it shows me what it looks like, it gives me sliders so I can play with it. There's the optical size. Now, this is a bit hard to understand because the font is being shown at the same size. What this is actually doing, though, is showing you what shape you would get with a large one or a small one. Excuse me. So in general, if you're doing work with variable fonts, I would recommend using this website. It's a great way to explore what the font is and what it can do. Even better, what it actually gives you is some CSS which puts classes for all of the different things that the font can do. It makes them up, so when you download it, all you have to do to use a particular effect is find out what the class is called and put that class on your text and you're done. So pretty super cool. the person who actually invented the term responsive web design, when a couple of years ago when he first came across variable fonts, he said that he thought this was the biggest change to responsive web design since the term was invented, using variable fonts. Okay, enough of that. Let's go on to color fonts. So this background here is an interesting thing. In India, there is a tradition of painting using colored paints onto fabric to make storefronts and that sort of thing, you know, commercial advertising. And that craft is now dying out because people use cheaper things. They'd like have something printed off. But the people that do this, you know, it's a dying tradition. So a font designer went around India, talked to these people, recorded interviews with them, and got them to make fonts for him. And they're like, well, we don't have computers, we don't know how to do that. He said, no, just draw them and I'll turn them into a font. And this is what they produced. They produced cloth for him, huge pieces of cloth, the length of this room with these huge letters painted on in color. And he's like, oh, actually, I just meant black and white. They're like, well, we don't do it like that, we do it in color. So nowadays you can actually have multiple colored fonts, and I'm going to tell you about that. So here we have an illuminated manuscript from the Middle Ages. You can't do that in modern printing, all this color, that went away. When we went to printing, we just went to black and white. And obviously everyone wants to do these illuminated manuscripts, right? I mean, there's a huge demand for that. Okay, there isn't really. That's not really why we did color fonts. This is why we did color fonts. So we can have pictures of poop and things like that, and smiley faces, and flags and stuff. But yes, as soon as there was a need for that, then we needed color fonts. And we didn't want just pixelated fonts. We didn't just want raster fonts. We wanted proper vector fonts. And so there were various proposals for how to do this, and the OpenType spec was extended to allow for color fonts. I showed you that already. Okay, so here's an example. This is the sort of thing people have done for ages in print. And you can do this on the web too, or you could. And it looked sort of okay until you realized it was a fake. It's actually the same text multiple times, just put on top of each other, all in a different color. Horrible. Hideous. For one thing, your search engine optimization is going to go out the window if you put the same text 20 times. And also, when you edit it, you have to edit it 20 times. It's really annoying. But now we have these color fonts. So here's an example of a font editor which lets you do this. So I actually bought that font from the Indian designer, and it was supplied as 8 different fonts. And I brought them into a font editor, gave them default colors, combined them together, and exported it as an OpenType font. So the first proposal was called Color and CPAL. Color is a new OpenType table which holds not just a single TrueType outline, but multiple, like as a stack. And then CPAL is the palette, and it tells you what color each shape is. So there's an example. So that's actually being displayed as a color CPAL font. You can see that it really is text. I can edit it. It's, you know, it's real text. Is that cool? Is it cool? Yeah. No, it's not. It's terrible. It's awful. Where did the styling go? I have to put the colors in the font. What happens when I want to change my web page and use different colors? I have to make a new font. That's not how the web works. It's terrible. So in CSS4, we have, well, there are 2 things. One called font. So a font can have multiple palettes. For example, if you like coding in a dark background with white text, or if you like on a white background with dark text, you would have 2 palettes in your font, one for dark background, one for light background. So the font palette property lets you select between them. More interestingly, the font palette values @rule lets you override some or all of a palette. So you can say, I don't want that red, I want my nice green instead. And you can override them using the normal CSS syntax and change it to what you want. That means that the styling is actually where it belongs, back in the style sheet. So here's another example. So in this case, we're using SVG glyphs in an OpenType font to do the glyph outlines, also using CPAL, and then using @font palette values to alter the palette. And here's an example. It's actually the same font but exported in SVG format. And let's have a look and see how that works. So there we are. We've overridden several of these and we're going to change them. Let's see, make it a different color. Yeah? So I can just edit these as I want and the font changes color. That's cool. That's actually useful. That's something we can use in production. Okay, so that was the fairly new stuff from Fonts 4. I'm now going to go back a little bit to Fonts 3. I've been giving that part of the talk for a couple of years, and when I started I had to say, look, this doesn't really work very well, but I'm going to show you as the future. It's not the future anymore. This is actually interoperable across all the browsers now. So we're going to do stuff like this. So OpenType has these features which are optional controls on a font. And what CSS does is it lets you play with them, change them. Now, this has actually been available for a while. It was used in print quite a lot. It wasn't used on the web. One of the reasons was, until we had reliable downloadable fonts, you didn't know what font someone was going to view your website in. So you couldn't rely on any special features because they might be using a different font. Once we have downloadable fonts, though, you know what font they're using because you're providing it along with the CSS, so it works much better. Also, there are two syntaxes for this. There's font variant, which at first wasn't very well supported. It's now pretty well supported. And then there's a low-level font feature settings, which again uses these 4-digit cryptic things, which I suggest you don't use. All of my examples are going to be using font variant. So here's an example. If we look at this, we've got the numbers and we've got some letters and lowercase and uppercase letters. Now you notice that the numbers on the top row are like uppercase letters. They don't have descenders and ascenders. They all line up. Where on the bottom, yeah, you've got these descenders, like on the letter J, there's a descender, and it doesn't look as good. But by just changing one property, you can use what's called old style numbers, which have ascenders and descenders. So you can change it as you wish, and that's quite a simple, easy thing. It's the same characters. Remember, the characters are just numbers, right? This is the character for a 5, this is the character for a 7. But by changing what glyphs are used in the font, we get a better presentation. Here's another example. Now, Unicode does have some fractions in it. It has a half and a quarter and this sort of thing. It certainly doesn't have 13/27ths. Also, if you put those sort of fractional characters in your page, no one can search for them. No one's going to type in hunt and find out what the character for a half is and put that in. So you're actually better using a slash like that, but then it doesn't look as good until you apply one CSS property to it and they all turn into fractions. Nice separation there between the content and the style. The style makes it look correct and the content is good and searchable. Looking at these three numbers, imagine this was money, and you look and you're trying to find the biggest one. And it looks like the one beginning with an 8 would be the biggest number because, you know, the others start with a 1 and a 2 and this one starts with an 8. But no, because they don't line up. Now you could fix that by putting a monospace font, but monospace fonts look hideous. So instead what you want is to use proportional letters, but just the numbers change to being tabular numbers so they all line up. Again, one line change, one property, and now you can see clearly where the numbers are, and that's only 89,000, not 200,000. Any questions so far? Is everything clear? Am I speaking too fast or anything? Is it all good? Good. Okay. Good. So here's another one. Someone mentioned that we have ligatures before, so there are ligatures in use in this. Not very many. These are just the normal ligatures. There's an FL ligature, for example. But I can switch on optional ligatures, and now we get stuff like this. The R and the O and the LE adjust to different forms, and the R has a nice swash to it. You can also switch them off, which you normally shouldn't do, but the value is there. Switches everything off, including notice the F and the L are now colliding with each other and not looking very good. You wouldn't normally want to do that. When you download a font, or even when you use a font that's installed on your system, it doesn't always have an italic version, a bold italic, etc. So when the browser gets some styling that tells it, oh, I want a bold italic, sometimes it has to fake it, sometimes it has to make one up. It can make an italic by just slanting the letter over, and it can make a bolder weight just by basically drawing a line around the edge and making it look thicker. This is not very nice. It's not very pretty, but it's better than nothing. In CSS, you have a new font synthesis property, and that's the default value, weight and style, which means sure, go ahead and synthesize these things. But you can also switch it off. And that means don't try and fake these things. Don't use fake bold. Don't use fake italic. We tried that with a few different fonts. So that one, notice this one is in bold, so it actually does come with a bold, whereas the first one I had just had a single. Oh, this is a particularly interesting example. It's a nice swashy italic, and if I set font synthesis back to the usual value, it does a fake italic. It looks horrible. So you'll be glad about this property because it means if you're providing all the fonts, you can stop this nastiness happening. Do people know what kerning is in a font? Hands? Just also to show that people are still awake. Good. So font kerning is where the space between the letters varies depending on how much space they take up. So we notice we have the V and the A, and they both have lines like this. You can pull them closer together, and they don't collide with each other. Whereas letter spacing is a fixed amount of space between all of the characters. So let's show what happens here. Now there are three values. Auto means do whatever you do. As usual with CSS, whenever we make up a new property, we have to account for how did this display in web pages before we made this property. So we always have an initial value, the default value, be basically a magic keyword auto, which means do whatever. And then there's normal, which means you ought to be kerning. In this case, there was no change because the browser I'm using was already kerning anyway. And then there's none, which switches it off. And you can see it jump there. You can see that the V and A are further apart. It looks less evenly spaced without kerning because our eye sees these gaps. Whereas when kerning is on, the actual spacing is irregular, but it looks visually more regular. And then there's letter spacing, which we can increase like that to space everything out. You shouldn't go overboard with letter spacing, but it can be nice used slightly. And you can reduce it and make it negative. Don't ever do this. This is a terrible thing to do to a web page. I've pretty much finished here. I have a little bit more because I thought I might be running quick on time. So how many people want to hear a little bit about improving font loading performance? And how many people would rather just go to the break? Okay, let's do font loading. Good. So, font display. When you load a font, there are three phases that happen. The first one is called the block period. What means is the font hasn't loaded, but it's probably going to, so let's just hang on and not render anything on the page and wait for the font to arrive. Obviously, you don't want to do that too long, otherwise the user's just looking at a blank screen on their phone or whatever, and they go, oh, this doesn't work, go away. Then you have the swap period. It's where, okay, it's been going for a while now, it's not going to load. What other fonts do we have that we've already got? And we'll use those instead. And then lastly, there's the failure period. This is where either the font has come in and it's broken, the URL's broken, something like that, and you basically go to the next font in the font stack, assuming you provided more than one font. Now, for a long while, the browsers were all over the place as to what they did with this. In particular, Safari would block forever. So if you had a font and it took, it was the URL was wrong or the site was down, you would get to see white, nothing, no text forever. And people didn't like that. So we now have in CSS4 fonts a font display descriptor. And you take these three phases and you give them values. Now you don't have to put in numbers. We thought that was kind of unfriendly, having to put in how many milliseconds, whatever. So we have some keywords instead. The first one is auto. Remember, as I said to you, auto means do whatever you did before. So if you set auto, then you might as well not have done anything because we don't know what's going to happen. More useful values, block, means that we have a 3-second block period. 3 seconds is a good default. If it hasn't arrived by then just fail, immediately fail, and go to the next font. Swap, on the other hand, doesn't block at all. As soon as the HTML has loaded, it says, okay, do I have that font? Yes, no, no. Okay, let's go into the swap period. What other fonts do I have? This is the immediate response thing. I don't care what it looks like, but people have to be able to read my site immediately. That's that one. Then the fallback one, which has a short 100 millisecond block period, a 3-second swap period, and then it's on to failure, just go to the next one. So this gives you a reasonable chance that you will get the font you want as long as the site is performant, you'll get your fonts in, but it does mean that sort of roughly 3 seconds after they started looking at the page, you'll see a bit of a layout jig because it's brought in the fonts now and it's relayed out the page. And then there's the optional one, which means this font is pretty, but I honestly don't care. So it has a 100 milliseconds block, and then it goes straight on to failure. What it will do, though, is the next time you look at that site, because you'll have the font cached now, it will instantly use the new font. So it's a progressive enhancement if you expect people to use your website more than once. And we do hope people use our websites more than once, don't we? Okay, that really is me. There's some image credits and stuff. So this presentation has been made in HTML, CSS, JavaScript, SVG. It is not a PowerPoint. It is not a keynote. So I will be putting this up on the web, and I will send out the URL so that you can look at it. It will not necessarily look the same as you saw it here for 2 reasons. Firstly, I'm using a nightly build of Firefox. Yay! Let's live dangerously. Nightly build of Firefox, because that was the first one that actually supports variable fonts. It's already supported in Safari and Chrome, but in Firefox they're a little bit behind now. And the second thing is that some of the fonts I'm using here are web fonts. That's fine. And some of them are commercial fonts, and I can't just give them to everyone else. If I happen to have paid for them, that's fine, but they're only on my machine. But still, it will let you look at the text as well. You can see how the slides are done. And there we are. That's me. I hope that was interesting. Are there any questions? Okay. I wasn't looking to say who was up first, so...
Okay, I'm not sure how relevant it is. I wanted to ask about icon fonts, and I've noticed 2 approaches to implementing them. One is using ligatures,
right,
and just having regular words, the names of the icons as ligatures, and the other one is just using separate characters, usually just like weird range of Unicode. And I was wondering, do you have any opinion on it, like one way or another, which one is better?
Okay, so there are 2 things that you have to think about there. Firstly, what happens when the font doesn't load? So you want to avoid just weird characters. In particular, you want to avoid the situation where a letter A is a telephone box and a letter B is a mobile phone and a letter C is a car, because then if your font doesn't load, well, what does ABC mean, right? On the other hand, there are some actual points in Unicode which are defined to be a telephone or a car or whatever. So if you use those code points and the font doesn't load, okay, but you'll see it in a different font and it still has meaning. And yeah, sure, if you want to have a sort of tight suppose you had a table, and it's a very dense table, and you've got some column headers and row headers, and you want those to take up little space. So you could put the text in, it says, phone, P-H-O-N-E, but then you use a ligature to make that display much more condensed, and it has a picture of a phone. Perfectly reasonable. But so basically my answer to you, unfortunately, is it depends, but make sure it's still accessible and searchable.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, hello.
Hi.
Thank you for this presentation. And well, my first question is on how to load fonts. So now we're trying to use HTTP2 with server push to make it as fast as possible. So would you recommend this or anything?
Yes, so I actually perhaps foolishly removed a section of slides from this talk all about performance, which I kind of regret now. So one of the things you can do obviously is use things like WAF and WAF2, which compress the fonts down. But especially in the old case where you're not using variable fonts, you'll have a lot of fonts downloading, and we don't want these to be pipelined one behind the other or blocking. So yes, using HTTP2 will give you a definite benefit as long as you set up your website appropriately. Then you'll download them all in parallel, and it will be also prioritized. The fonts later on in the document that actually are below the fold won't get loaded until you scroll the document, this sort of thing. So yeah, HTTP2 is doing a lot of work for you. You should use it, definitely.
Great, and one more. So you showed during font declaration there was like a restriction that we could set for font weight from 100 to 900.
Yes.
So the purpose of this restriction, does it, well, it's just like foolproofing, or it affects memory size, anything like that?
Okay, what it's doing is if you know that you have a font and it goes from bold to very bold, you can say that in the app font face, and then if you're asking for an ultra light, well, it's not going to match, and so it'll go on to the next font in the stack. It avoids you well, it's two things. Firstly, it avoids you downloading a font that you can't actually use. And secondly, it avoids you downloading a font that the designer didn't like it. Suppose I'm one of these designers and I go, I just can't stand that. The lightweights are terrible. This one's much better. So I can actually say, no, don't use those. Just restrict the range down. Or, you know, I like the Cyrillic in this one, but I don't like the Greek. So just only use the Cyrillic from this font. It's that sort of thing. You still do download the entire font. So I should clarify that. Unicode range still means you download the entire font. It just affects how much of it you use. Good news. We are now looking at W3C at doing what we call progressive font enrichment. The idea is you have a big font that has lots of character ranges and stuff. You download some subset. Now, previously what you did was you created the subset manually, you stuck it on your server, you called it, you know, foo-Cyrillic, and it only does Cyrillic and doesn't do Latin, doesn't do Greek, doesn't do Japanese. But that's a separate, in terms of a caching story, that's, you're filling your cache up with lots of different variants of the same font, all of which are cut in different ways. Especially if you're doing it, so this page only uses these characters and this page uses them different characters, you end up with all these subset fonts polluting your cache. What we're trying to do instead is pull down a font, and it has two pieces of metadata with it. One is, this is what the original font can do, and the second one is, this is what the subset can do. But also, you can then say, okay, now actually I want to say you're on a forum, right? So that the actual content isn't controlled by you. People type in multiple languages, and you don't know what they're going to put next. So someone starts typing in Arabic, and it's oh, we know the original font does Arabic. So you send a special request back up and you get basically a diff down and it stitches it into the original font. Instead of having lots and lots of little fonts, you basically have one font that improves over time.
It's like lazy loading, right?
Yes, it's like lazy loading. This isn't something you can use. It's not even something that has a specification yet, but we have people. So Monotype has done a prototype of that. Adobe did a different prototype. Google did some stuff. Actually, with Korean, they did a thing where they used machine learning on Korean texts to figure out what characters were used with what other characters, and then made special subsets and downloaded them like that. Lots of clever stuff. But all of these show that progressively enhancing a font during its lifetime of use is helpful, and we're actually working on that. Probably in the next year, we'll start work on that.
Wow, that's great. Thank you. Thank you very much.
More questions?
Hi, thanks for the presentation. My question is about variable fonts.
Yes.
Now we have an old corporate font, and what we should do for convert it or transform it to variable font.
Okay, so it's a lot of work to make lots of different weights and sizes of a font, and the font designers knew this a long time ago. So in practice, what they were doing was some sort of precursor of variable fonts. They were using some system like Superpolator or whatever like that, which in production would allow them to interpolate between designs, make whatever they wanted. And then they would basically set the sliders to a point that they wanted and say, export that, change the sliders, export that, and make all these separate fonts. If your font designer was doing that, then the good news is they can probably just cut out all those steps and start shipping a variable font. On the other hand, if each face was hand-drawn individually, the problem is that all of the points on the curve for each letter have to line up. Suppose you have a G and it has 17 points around it, but you have a bolder G and it has 24 points. It can't interpolate. It doesn't know which ones match with the other ones. So there has to be a certain discipline in the design to make them all match up. So a lot of fonts are being re-released as variable font versions. So it depends really, is it a commercial font? Is it a font that was bespoke for your company? Is it an open source font, etc.? And depending on the answer to that, you can go back to the designer and say, this is what we want now. It's worth doing because, yes, it will increase your page load times. It will give you more artistic capabilities because you can use a wider range of weights and styles in the same document without having a load penalty. Did that answer the question? Thank you.
Any other questions? No? Chris, may I ask you then sorry.
Okay, I have
Yes?
one question. I'm surprised nobody asked it before, but the first question came to my mind was browser support. You told that font variables are already supported by Firefox, Chrome, and Safari, right? What about
Right, so Safari has variable font support and was the first one to have it. It was in Technical Preview 16 and onwards. Then Chrome added it. And in Safari, it depended on OS X, right? It didn't work on anything else. Well, Safari doesn't. But any other WebKit build relied on OS X as well. It was using operating system support. Chrome released their version, and because they're on Android and Mac OS and Windows and Linux and whatever, they actually used their own font rasterizer, FreeType. So when they released variable font support, it worked in Chrome on any platform that Chrome works on. So that was good. Microsoft, with the Windows 10 Spring update, they released a version of Windows 10 which had variable font support and also optical sizing support. So Edge has the beginnings of that. It's not fully integrated at the browser level yet, but the technology is there and they're starting to add it in. And they've said publicly this is a high priority for them, and so they're working on it. Firefox also has the problem. It's on multiple platforms, so they have to do it all themselves. So the reason I was using a Firefox nightly there is because it's in Firefox 62, and the beta of Firefox, which is my normal browser, is 61, so it wouldn't have worked, but in 62 it will, and on versions on from there. So yeah, actually, compared to some other web technologies where there's a big spread, one browser does it, another one does it 5 years later, etc., pretty much all the browsers are coordinating now, and they've rolled out variable fonts within a year or so of each other. So it is definitely improving. You will be able to use this either now or fairly soon, depending on how far back you have to go. And also remember, this is a progressive enhancement, right? You can say, at font face, here's my variable font. If you don't understand that, here's 8 other fonts. Download those instead. So there is a fallback strategy. It means that people with the older browsers will have a slower experience, but they will still have a similar experience.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Can you put font face inside at supports? Because then that would be a good strategy for the fallback. Like you could say at supports font weight 326, and then if a browser supports variable fonts, then whatever is inside that block will be ignored. If a browser doesn't support variable fonts, then whatever is inside that block will be ignored.
So that's a good suggestion, but no, you can't put at font face inside at supports. However, and you should know this, I know you're feeding me a question because you were there on the meeting when we decided this. So at font face already has a format specifier, so you can say this one is in WAF and this one is in TrueType and this sort of thing. We've added something onto that that says requires. So you can say requires variations, requires color. So you only download it if you only download it if you support the feature it says is required.
Are browsers implementing this required feature at the same time as variable fonts, though?
It was only decided like less than a month ago, so it will do. They will do, yes.
Cool, thanks.
So, Chris, may I ask you to choose the most interesting question in your opinion, because we give special stickers to the participants who ask the most interesting questions.
I think the one about HTTP2 and so on was a very interesting question. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris, for your presentation.